at the same time. All right, so hello everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University in Shanghai, where the 四海为学 collaborative learning project is based. Today, we want to welcome everyone to our first lecture in 2024. We are very happy to be hosting Professor Edward Slingerland from the University of British Columbia. We have a very nice lineup of scholars from different places to discuss with Professor Edward Slingerland. Our commentators today include Shirley Chan from, oh, Shirley, I just forgot how to say her university again.
Macquarie University. Macquarie?
Yeah, Macquarie University. Professor Stephen Engel from Wesleyan University, and we also have Liu Menglu from Renmin University in Beijing serving as chair for this lecture. I want to thank everyone who's been invited and everyone in the audience for making this event possible. The topic of Professor Edward Slingerland's lecture is Literature, Moral Perception, and Early Confucian Virtue Ethics. The structure of the event is as follows. Liu Menglu will introduce Professor Edward Slingerland, and then Professor Slingerland will give his talk. The two commentators then will discuss their comments with Professor Slingerland. I think normally what we do is we have, I think Shirley's first on the list, so Shirley will discuss, and we do it more like the American way, not the Chinese way with the questions and then all the answers, but have one discussion between the discussant participant, then the discussant lecturer. So we'll do it like that. And then once that's done, we'll open the floor for comments from the audience. We end promptly at 10:30 a.m. Shanghai time, and that's just under 90 minutes from now. Before getting started and handing things over to Liu Menglu, I want to say a couple things about the 四海为学 academic forum. The 四海为学 collaborative learning project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the less productive conventional practices in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or in any form of egoism or self-promotion. We hope to curb all types of aggressive and look at me, I'm smarter than you, or don't I know so much, and similar attitudes that we sometimes see in academic exchanges. The 四海为学 collaborative learning project seeks to accomplish these shifts in orientation during academic exchange by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are open and honest. We hope to foster these environments where people truly learn from and with one another. Before introducing our chair, I want to thank Professor Slingerland for taking time to present this lecture. Professor Slingerland is one of those rare professors who can communicate very well with broader non-academic audiences. He's written two very successful trade books, Trying Not to Try, which is a really great sort of it's also sort of just a great introduction, I think, to Chinese philosophy in some ways. And then also Drunk, which is maybe for a little bit more mature audience members. He also has a very popular TEDx talk and was even a guest on the Joe Rogan Experience. And this is all pretty impressive from someone who also translates the Analects, secures millions of dollars in grants. So to have both of these sides is really impressive. He's also the only participant for 四海为学 who I have to pay in whiskey. So that makes him unique as well. So now I want to hand things over to our chair, Professor Liu Menglu. She's a PhD candidate at Renmin University in China. She was a visiting scholar at the Institute of Philosophy in Kelu, Leuven, from 2022 to 2023. She majors in Chinese philosophy and specializes in Neo-Confucianism and normative ethics. She is also interested in comparative philosophy and in looking at how different philosophical traditions and cultures interact. So her doctoral dissertation focuses on the philosophical implications of historical evolution of the concept of oneness in Neo-Confucianism. Thank you, Liu Menglu.
Thank you, Professor Paul. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. So everybody can hear me? Yeah, thank you so much. It's my great honor to chair this lecture, and I'm so excited to introduce Professor Edward Slingerland to everybody. Okay, Professor Slingerland is a distinguished university scholar and professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia, where he also holds appointments in the Department of Psychology and Asia Study. Professor Slingerland is also director of the Database of Religious History, an online encyclopedia of religious cultural history. And he is a co-director of Center for Human Evolution, Cognition, and Culture. As we know, Professor Slingerland is an expert in wide variety of fields, such like early Chinese thought, comparative religion, and cognitive science of religion, ethics, cognitive linguistics, and humanities science integration. Just as Professor Paul mentioned, Professor Slingerland has written books on profound and interesting topics, such as Trying Not to Try, Ancient China, Modern Science, and the Power of Spontaneity. It ties together insights from early Chinese thought and modern psychological research. And another book is Drunk, How We Sipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization. It targets the standard scientific view of our taste for intoxicants as an evolutionary accident, argue that alcohol and other drugs have played a crucial role in helping humans to be more creative, trusting, and social. I don't know about others, but the first time when I saw the title, I immediately ordered this book online, and I really enjoy it. Thank you. And a new book by Professor Slingerland is forthcoming. Its title is highly relevant to today's lecture, which is Learning to Say Confucianism, Virtue Ethics, and Moral Perception. I'm really looking forward to read this book and to enjoy our lecture. So let's welcome Professor Edward Slingerland.
Thank you. Thank you for that very generous introduction. I do want to note that if you're in China, Drunk has an insane cover that I have nothing to do with. It's a much more serious book than this cover suggests. So yeah, look at the American version cover. I don't know where they came up with that. So thanks for having me. This is my current academic book project, and I'm still in the research stage. So I'm getting near the end of it, but I especially would welcome suggestions about literature that I haven't looked at, or things that I should read before I actually sit down and start writing. So this was inspired by, let me see if I can share my screen. Yeah. Oh, I can just share the keynote. Okay. Can everyone see that? All right. So this was inspired originally by getting back into Iris Murdoch. So I hadn't read Murdoch since I was an undergrad, and a grad student in my department had a reading group he started and read, the classic 3 essays, Sovereignty of the Good, and it got me very excited about this idea of moral perception and virtue ethics, and thinking about how this would relate to my area of specialty, which is early China, and particularly early Confucianism. So when we think about perception, I think we have this folk notion that we just open our eyes and the world presents itself to us as it is. So I think in the folk model, I think our kind of intuitive sense is there's a little person in our head, and when we open our eyes, that little person can kind of look out through the eyes and see what's out there in the world and then decide what to do. So we have this kind of homunculus view of perception. I think our sense is that the world is complex, but perception is simple. It's just, we just see the world as it is. This is not at all true. So our perception of the world is very much constructed by our brain-body system. So the brain creates things that aren't really there. So for instance, we have a blind spot in our visual field that's caused by where the optic nerve comes into the back of the retina. But we don't notice the blind spot because our brain fills in what it predicts should be in that blind spot. In a similar way, we actually we don't have color vision in our periphery, but our brain, because we don't have color cones there, but our brain fills in what it thinks the color should be in our periphery. So we see things in the world that aren't actually there because our brain is putting them there for us. There are also many instances where we actually don't see things that are there because our brain doesn't expect them to be there or think they should be there. So there's a huge literature now on what's called change blindness or inattention blindness. So the most famous study is called Gorillas in Our Midst. So the experimenters had subjects watch a video where students were throwing a ball back and forth playing this game, and their job was to count how many times the ball changed back and forth. And in the middle of the scene, a Confederate in a gorilla outfit wandered into the middle of the frame, did a little dance, and wandered out again. And people don't see it, which is hard to believe, but it's been replicated. This is one of the better replicated findings in psychology. That if you're focused on one thing, your attention's focused on one thing in the environment, you don't see some really big things that are happening just because you're not expecting them. So the brain puts things there that aren't there, and also doesn't see things that are there. This is because the brain-body system seems to be a prediction. So the brain is really a kind of prediction machine. It's not just passively receiving an account of the world from the senses. It's predicting what should be out there, and then the senses are helping the brain either correct or not correct that prediction. So Andy Clark has called the brain essentially a prediction machine. It's also, I think, very revealing that if you look at, sorry, my daughter just came back and the dog's going crazy. If you look at the architecture of the brain, feedback networks and networks that are feeding down into the lower perceptual regions from higher regions are 10 times as feed forward networks. So basically in the brain, there's a lot more information going from top down than is coming the other direction, bottom up, which is, again, I think counterintuitive. It's not the way we experience the world. So this idea that perception is very much about prediction, it's very much a top-down influenced process, is, I think, a problem for traditional rationalist views of ethics. So if we're looking, whether it's deontology, and we have a checklist of maxims that don't lie, don't steal, don't murder, that all depends on the idea that we can just look at the world and see that this is an instance of murder, this is an instance of lying. Then we apply our checklist, where we apply our ranking of maxims. Utilitarianism depends on the idea that there's value in the world that comes pre-labeled to us. We know this is a utility of 10, this is utility of 8. We use our rationality, we make our decision. I think that traditional, at least the models of ethics that have been dominant in Western philosophy recently, the work is happening after perception. So we just get told what's out there in the world, and then we make the real moral work is happening after perception. And that doesn't really seem to be the case. I mean, trolleyology is a classic example of this, where everything's kind of artificially simplified. In reality, the world is very complex. And if perception works the way we seem to understand that it works, the problem of morality is going to be a much earlier one than we've thought. The problem of being a moral person is going to be happening at a very early stage of perception, and not just be this kind of higher level rational thing. And this is, I think, where virtue ethics, so the model of ethics that arguably has been followed by everyone all around the world for most of history. We associate it in the West with Aristotle typically, or in China with Confucius. But virtue ethics has, I think, a much more accurate and realistic model of how, at least how moral psychology works, and therefore how moral training would work, than deontology or utilitarianism. So this is a case that's been made by people like John McDowell. So McDowell's argued that the virtue ethical framework, moral perception, is very important. Virtue is a reliable sensitivity to the moral dimensions of the situation, a sort of perceptual capacity, a proper attentiveness, a single complex sensitivity. So in virtue ethics, the problem of perception is made a moral one, and I think put in its proper place. Where's my slide not advancing? Martha Nussbaum has made similar observations. So situations are all highly concrete, and they don't present themselves with duty labels on them. Without the abilities of perception, duty is blind and therefore powerless. So real life is not a trolley problem where you're told there's 5 people here, there's 1 person here. You know for a fact that the fat guy will stop the trolley if you push him off the bridge. We don't know any of this stuff in real life. We don't even know, we don't typically even understand most of what's going on in our environment. And so progress, Nussbaum argues, comes not from teaching abstract laws, but by the friend, the child, the loved one, by a word, a story, or an image, leading us to see a new aspect of the concrete case, to see this or that. So again, it's about learning how to see. It's about learning how to see situations in the right way. Iris Murdoch, who kind of inspired this project, argues that it's a psychological fact and one of importance in moral philosophy that we can all receive moral help by focusing our attention upon things which are valuable. So again, focusing attention. Virtuous people, great art, perhaps the idea of goodness itself. Our ability to act when the time comes depends partly, perhaps largely, upon the quality of our habitual objects of attention. And I remember rereading this passage, this idea of caring about the quality of your habitual objects of attention should sound very familiar to anyone who studied early Confucianism. This is arguably what early Confucianism is about, is shaping and controlling the habitual objects of our attention in order to shape our dispositions. So if we think about passages like 12.1, Yan Hui asks about goodness. The master says, restraining yourself and returning to the rights constitutes goodness. If for one day you manage to restrain yourself, return to the rights, you could lead the entire world back to goodness. And Yan Hui says, well, what specifically is involved in doing this? And Confucius says, gives him some perceptual restrictions. Do not look unless it's in accordance with ritual. Do not listen unless it's in accordance with ritual. Do not speak. Do not move unless it's in accordance with ritual. So restricting and redirecting our objects of attention is central to Confucian self-cultivation. In the book that I'm working on now and the talk today, I'm not going to talk about ritual very much. I'm going to talk instead about another type of object of attention, another type of cultural technology, literature. And I want to talk specifically about the way the Analects uses one form of literature, the Book of Odes, in its model of self-cultivation. And then also, so talk about both the Odes, use of the Odes as a piece of literature, and then I'll also say a little something about the Analects itself as a piece of literature and how that functions in self-cultivation for the early Confucians. And the way I'm going to organize my talk is by using this passage 17.9, which kind of sums up Confucius's view of the Odes. And I love the beginning of this. Why do none of you learn the Odes? Now, of course, all his students are doing is studying the Odes. They've all memorized the Odes. So he's clearly is exaggerating for effect because he wants to make sure they understand how important it is that they study the Odes. The Odes do a variety of things, and let's walk through what those things are. First of all, they awaken discernment. So this term xing, which is a very important term of art, obviously, in Odes interpretation. So what's going on in awakening discernment? Kong An Guo, one of the earliest commentators on the text, glosses it this way. The odes evoke metaphors and analogies that allow one to connect things that belong to similar categories. So they're giving you a category or a narrative or a frame or a concept that allows you to see how something in your life is similar to something else that for instance, is given to you in the odes. Mark Edward Lewis has described the use of the odes in the Zuozhuan in a similar type of way. He says, speakers invoke verses on the difficulties of travel and damp weather as a figure for disasters caused by not addressing one's own situation, picking plants as an image for selecting talent, the relations between man and woman as a model for those between weak and strong states, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got these organizing narratives that give us a frame for understanding something new that we're experiencing in our life. He further describes the process of using the odes as a way to extract moral lessons through positing figuration. So we're getting these figures, these tropes that allow us to extract moral lessons. I think you see this function, awakening discernment, in passages like, or in poems like Mao number 26, The Cypress Boat. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to read the entire poem, but it's an account of a woman who is being married off against her will. We have to understand, as someone kind of unworthy, no one understands her, no one sympathizes with her. My sad heart is consumed. I'm harassed by a host of small men. So she's being done poorly by her male relatives. Oh, sun, oh, moon, why are you so dim? Sorrow clings to me like an unwashed dress. So one of my favorite lines in the odes. She is kind of bravely being virtuous, but she is not. She's being mistreated by her male relatives, and she's about to suffer this unpleasant fate. This seems to have been understood from very early times in a metaphorical way as a minister who is being mistreated by his lord, who's not being treated properly. And you can see how, as a man in a type of situation where I feel like I'm not being appreciated, where I'm being mistreated, I would draw, first of all, this poem would give me a category for understanding what was happening to me. I am wronged. I am virtuous in the midst of a lot of unvirtuous people. I've received all these insults. Still of night, I brood upon it. It gives me some resonance for the way I'm feeling. And it gives me a moral category. It's a different instance than being a wronged minister, but it gives me some emotions. It gives me some conceptual categories to help me understand who I am morally vis-a-vis the people around me. So I think this is an example of this awakening discernment. I also think other examples we see in passages like 115, where Zogong says, poor without being obsequious, rich without being arrogant. What would you say about someone like this? Confucius answers, and Zogong then quotes an ode. He says, as of cut, as of polish, as of carved, as of ground, is this not what you have in mind? And the master says, Zogong, you're precisely the kind of person with whom one can begin to discuss the odes. Informed as to what has gone before, you know what is to come. So he has this ability, Zogong, to take an image from the odes and see how this helps us to understand Confucian self-cultivation. So it gives us these kind of categories for understanding what we're doing when we're cultivating ourselves morally. So let's go back to 17.9. The odes awaken discernment. They also serve as a basis for moral judgment. So how do they do this? One passage I love in Analects 9:31 begins with a quote from a lost ode. The flowery branch of the wild cherry, how swiftly it flies back. Of course, I am thinking of you. It is just that your house is so far away. So, I love you so much, but, it's a bit of a hassle. You live in a suburb, and the rush hour is really hard. It's hard to get out there. I'm following Arthur Waley's interpretation of this ode and commentators who argue that This is about someone who claims to be in love, but is not real. If he was in love, he would find a way to get to his lover. And it's understood as a analogy of someone who claims they love the Confucian way, but just can't seem to find time to study the odes, or Zaiwa, they can't manage to get to class on time in the morning. So it's a critique. It's these images like this kind of insincere lover give you an image that allows you to then pass judgment upon others. So Confucius says he was not really thinking of her. If he were, what difference would the distance make? And this is a targeted not only as the poet in this poem, but at his students who are not the ones who are not showing up on time or working hard enough. So the basis for moral judgment. They also give you the means to affiliate with your peers and to properly express complaints to your superiors. This is a really important function of the odes, where they're giving you really the language that allows you to communicate with others. Let me, I need to move. I have everyone's pictures on the right and I can't read my slides. Okay, well, I'll do my best without being able to see the right portion of this. The recitation of poetry, so this is David Schaberg, was the most common, generally available expression of Zhou cultural norms. By recitation, the representatives of separate states demonstrate their conviction that peaceful contact between the states will always involve men who, in their poetry and hermeneutical conventions, are able to engage in this type of ceremonial communication. So it's giving, the odes gave educated members of the various warring states a common language they could use. So not just to organize. So in the kind of Xing function, you're helping to understand yourself, understand what's happening to you. In this function, you're able to communicate very effectively and powerfully your understanding to other people. And this, I think, is the understanding of the use of the odes that we see in 13.5, when Confucius says, imagine a person who can recite several hundred odes by heart, but when delegated a government task, can't carry it out, or when sent abroad as an envoy, is unable to engage in repartee. No matter how many odes he may have memorized, what good are they to him? So the odes here are this ritualized language you can use to communicate efficiently and in an appropriately indirect way. I mean, so we see this happening in the Zhuozhan, where people are quoting these odes to each other. And, by quoting this kind of elusive ode, I'm saying, if you don't do this, I'm going to invade you and kill you and take your stuff. But I would never say that directly. So I've come up with a way to say this indirectly with an ode. It's an elegant way to communicate situations to other educated people who also have this category of the odes to understand what I'm saying. So it's very efficient, kind of shared collection of tropes and shared collection of narratives that allow not just me to organize my own moral life, but allow me to communicate effectively to others and get them to share or kind of see through the same narrative lens what I'm seeing. In the home, so going on, they teach you how to serve your father. In public space, they teach you how to serve your Lord. So I think this function of the odes has to do with providing moral exemplars. So we get paradigmatic figures who teach us about virtue. For instance, this ruler, so Mao 250, he stacked piece to word, he tied up the meats and grain in knapsacks and bags. Far and wide he gathered his store with bows and arrows. He tested shield and dagger, halberd back, and then he began his march. So this is a paradigmatic ruler who doesn't go to war until everything's been prepared. He's taken care of his people. They have enough food, they have enough grain, everything, the weapons are all in order. This is how a proper ruler acts. So we have exemplars, we get examples of how a true ruler should act. We also get some more domestic examples. So this is Mao 82. The lady says the cock has crowed. The gentleman says day is not dawned. She replies, "Rise then and look at the night. The morning star is shining. You must be out and abroad, must shoot the wild duck and wild geese. When you have shot them, you must bring them home, and I will dress them for you. And when I have dressed them, we will drink wine, and I will be yours until we are old." That really is I love this poem. And again, it's presenting us with a scene that is telling us something about proper human relations. This is a very sweet image of how, in a loving married couple, the wife can gently remonstrate with her husband and get him out of bed and out doing what he's supposed to do. It gives us a model of what a good marriage looks like, essentially, what true marital love looks like. That gives us something to aspire to. So we get these models of proper behavior and different types of roles, situations through the odes. And then finally, there's this line, they also broadly acquaint you with the names of various birds, beasts, plants, and trees. This is the most puzzling part of this passage. And what I love about this is it's one of the few times you ever see Zhu Xi stumped, because everything else he can tell you, oh, this means this. This is just like what Mencius meant by this other thing. And this one, he just punts. He just basically repeats the line, and we don't learn anything more from Zhu Xi. I'm not sure he knew what to make of it. It's a bit puzzling, but I think that this idea, the idea of learning to see actually helps us to understand this last line of this passage in the Analects. So why do we want to learn the names of the various birds, beasts? Why would that matter? The way I understand it has something to do with an experience that I had as a teenager in suburban New Jersey, where I would go to school every day on the school bus and pass these fields that, I'd look at out the window, and they were just full of weeds as far as I could tell. And then at a certain point, because I was a strange teenager, I found some book in a used bookstore about wild edible plants. And I got really into like learning about all these plants and the environment, in the neighborhood I lived in, and what they could be used for. And it completely transformed the way I saw this field. So I was on the bus just like I was before. I would look out the window, and crucially, the same photons were hitting my eyes as before, when I only saw a field of weeds. But I no longer just saw a field of weeds. I saw yarrow, I saw sorrel, I saw blackberries. My perception was completely transformed, even though the data coming into my retina were arguably exactly the same as previously. So this is a phenomenon that has been sometimes called the expertise effect. People like Susanna Siegel have written quite a bit about this, the fact that, once you know the difference between a pine tree and a spruce tree and a sycamore, you don't see just trees anymore, you see these different species. So there's a very powerful, once we have categories, once we have labels for things, we see the world in a completely different way. And this is true. I also experienced this with, I kayak surf, and the learning how to surf a kayak, learning how to surf, I'm sure that when I'm standing with someone looking at the ocean with them and they don't have any surfing experience, and that it's waves out there, they just see waves. They're like, oh, waves. Whereas I see a left curl, and I'm looking at all the afforded, because of these skills I've developed, I see the world through affordances that I've developed. And this is a very powerful perceptual effect on humans. Again, one of the more well-attested findings in the psychology of perception, some of the earliest studies of this was famous, looked at chess experts. If you give chess experts and novices, so people who don't know anything about chess, you show them very briefly a picture of a chessboard with pieces in some arrangement, and then you take it away and you ask them to reproduce what they saw. Experts can reproduce a chessboard exactly, having just seen it for whatever, 3 or 4 seconds, whereas novices can't do this at all. But this is only true if it's a real chess game that's happening. If you've just reorganized the pieces, if you just organize the pieces randomly, experts and non-experts are the same in their recall. And what this clearly demonstrates is that when a chess expert looks at a scene like this, and I actually don't know if this is a real chess game or not because I don't play chess. If I were a chess expert and I looked at this and this were a real game, I would not just see a collection of pieces on a board. I would see a aggressive Markov strategy, or someone trying this defense, and I would see forces, lines of forces. I'd see it in terms of these categories that I have, and that's why I'd be able to reproduce it in a way that I couldn't if it was a meaningless jumble of pieces. So this is a very well attested effect that experts just see the world in a different way than non-experts do. So I think this is why are we learning the names of plants and animals? Because we're learning that our world is meaningful, including the natural world. So we have these various odes that teach us what the different species mean. So the ospreys and the famous Mao #1 represent this faithful married couple. The oriole in Mao #2 represents the longing for home. The owl in another Mao represents success in certain types of undertakings. We learn these associations of the natural world for the Confucians is not meaningless. Plants and animals have moral meanings. They have a kind of metaphorical importance to them. But all of this is closed off to you if you actually don't know what an osprey looks like, or you don't know when you recognize an oriole. I think that this is a really important, it's important for Confucius that when you look at the natural world, you don't see it the way I used to see this field of weeds from the bus. You see the yarrow, you see the sorrel, and you understand what they mean. And that then situates you in a meaningful world and not just a kind of random collection of things. So let me move on so this is the use of the odes by the Analects. I will also want to talk very briefly about the Analects itself as literature. Passages like 1542 are sometimes hard to make sense of. So the blind music master came to see Confucius. When they came to the steps, the master said, "Here are the steps." When they reached his seat, the master said, "Here's your seat." After everyone was seated, the master informed him as to who was present, saying, "So-and-so is seated here, so-and-so is seated over there." And then Zhejiang asked when he left, "Is this the way to converse with the music master?" And Confucius says, "Yes, indeed." This is one of these many passages that just sound like nonsense without commentary to Western philosophers. What's going on here? I think that what's going on here is Confucius is faced with a new situation, and he's violating ritual protocol in order to respond to this the person who can't see and needs to be helped on the steps, who needs to be helped to his seat. Confucius knows what to do in situations where it's ambiguous what the right thing to do is. I think, I've argued previously that this is the way to understand things like Book 10 of the Analects. So Book 10 is a strange book, and most Western philosophers kind of skip over it if they even talk about it at all. It has these strange, at court, when speaking to officials of lower rank, he was pleasant and affable. When speaking with officers of upper rank, he was this other way. We learn about his reaction to the stables burning down. We learn about how he reacts to gifts. These all seem quite random unless you see them as essentially, I think the way to understand passages like these is they're a kind of training video. So we don't have Confucius around anymore to serve as a literal paragon, someone we can see act in the world. So these are accounts of his behavior that we're supposed to model ourselves on. So in this sense, the Analects as a piece of literature is giving us organizing categories and narratives in the same way that the odes serve for Confucius as paradigmatic categories to organize our sense of the world, our moral sense of the world. So that's the basic argument of the book. Some remaining questions. What's the right way to see is kind of a problem if you take this the importance of seeing correctly. Confucius didn't have this problem, right? He knew there was a right way to see. It was a way the Western Joe King saw. It was expressed in this book passed down from them, the Odes. In a modern multicultural world, is a bit more problematic how we're going to understand how to see. So people like Schneewind have pointed out that Aristotle also didn't have this problem. He lived in a small community. There was a recognized class of superior citizens. We knew who the phronimoi were, but we don't live in that world anymore. So what do we do? How do we deal with this problem? Loudon also makes a similar point. Aristotle doesn't even see the problem of identifying the phronimos as problematic because we all know who they are. But this again this is because Aristotle's living in a small community where everyone knows each other. There are certain well-established families who we all know are the virtuous people. And Aristotle's own methodology is designed for this sort of community. So what do we do in a modern multicultural world where we don't agree on who the phronimoi are, and we also crucially don't agree on what the right kind of literature is that we would use to shape our dispositions. Even some more recent commentators kind of don't have this problem. So Martha Nussbaum's pretty sure that Henry James got it right. So, she's very much steeped in this kind of Chicago great books model where we know what the great works of literature are. There are these works of European literature. Murdoch also doesn't have this problem because she's a Neoplatonist. She thinks that there is a right way to see the world. And so what's the right kind of literature? It's the literature that allows us to see the world properly, that helps us to strip away our selfishness and see the world as it really is. It's not clear to me how we deal with this problem if we're not Neoplatonists or we're not sure that Henry James is the epitome of literature. There may be a section of the book where I deal with this problem that I call accounting for taste, trying to figure out if there's any commonalities in what people judge as good art in different art forms. So I'm not going to get into this. I'm running out of time, but there seems to be some markers of things like complexity that people identify as attributes of better art across different domains. So music, visual art, things like that. So that may be one way to go, but this is a big problem that I may just gesture at and move on. Another issue I have is, do I look at other pre-Chin texts besides the Analects? And I think of this as, how do we get beyond the Slingerland problem? So my impression, and people can correct me on this, is that in both the Mencius and the Shunzi, they occasionally take the Odes seriously as tools of self-cultivation, but not really. Mostly they make a philosophical argument and then they quote an ode and say, Slingerland, that's what I was talking about. They use it as this kind of authoritative cap in a way that seems to me more superficial than the way the Analects is approaching the Odes. So that's an issue I have to deal with. But and one of the things I need to get into is these relatively recently discovered texts that may be looking more like the Analects in terms of taking the Odes seriously as moral resources. Another question is, do I look at music and ritual as well? Certainly music, for instance, is a very important art form for Confucius. 714, when he was in the state of Qi, he heard the Shao music, and for 3 months did not notice the taste of meat. He said, I never imagined that music could be so sublime. So I'm not sure if I'm going to get into other art forms besides literature. So to conclude, there's one of the things I lost about 6 months of my life to the literature on the cognitive penetrability of perception. There's this huge debate in philosophy and psychology about the extent to which cognition permeates perception. Ned Block has a recent 800-page book on the topic. He argues at one point that maybe this is really a definitional debate, but it really, different views make different predictions. So there's a recent study, this is in press right now, and I know about it because it's my partner's research team. They showed people movie clips, and they were using hyperscanning, where you can use fMRI and scan the brains of two subjects at the same time. So they showed people these movie clips that were very hard to interpret. So here's one. No introduction, we don't know what's going on. What's going on? Like, who's she relative to the boy? Who's the guy in the hallway? We have no idea. So they show this clip to people. They then give them a chance to sit around and come to a consensus about what was going on in the clip. So they decide who the woman is, what her relationship to the kid is. Then they put them back. So they scan them while they're seeing it for the first time. They have a discussion. They put them back in the scanners, and they have them rewatch these clips again, having come to a consensus about what they're about. And then crucially, they have them watch new clips that they haven't seen before, but that involve the same characters. And what they find is that the narrative synchronized brain activity, and this is crucial, I think, even in the lowest level visual areas. So you see the synchrony happening after conversation, people synchronize significantly. And the hot spots, the red spots here, that's the visual, like really lower level visual areas of the brain. Crucially, again, this is happening, this coordination in visual areas is happening at a really low level of perception. So again, looking at the areas where you see the variance being explained, it's visual object recognition, some low level stuff. And the authors themselves say what seems to be happening in conversation is a future alignment of visual intention. And I think this is where, if you have the folk view of perception, we all see the same world, but then we then talk about it at higher levels, decide what the narrative is. If that were the case, what you should see in studies like this is that everyone, even after the discussion, everyone's perceptual regions should be all over the place. And where you'd see convergence would be in the higher regions, where we actually talk about narratives and put labels on things. But that's not at all what we're seeing. We're seeing that the conversation actually changes everything all the way down to like V1, the first areas of vision. So that suggests that these narratives are really fundamentally changing the way we see the world. Let me skip over Kong and Guo again, but this idea of these schemas that organize our perception, creating consensus between individuals and a society, is, I think, a really important theme that we see. And this is something that people like Nussbaum have talked about, the role of narratives in getting people on the same moral page. And Murdoch at one point says, one of the main problems of moral philosophy might be formulated thus: are there any techniques for the purification and reorientation of an energy which is naturally selfish, in such a way that when moments of choice arrive, we shall be sure of acting rightly? And for her, acting rightly means seeing the world rightly. And so what are these techniques for purification? I think they're cultural practices like literature. So in summary, I think the Analects see the odes, this piece of literature, as a crucial technology for teaching us how to see the world in the right way, and therefore to respond to the world the right way. And I think this really, from a modern scientific perspective, makes sense in terms of how our perception works and how perception and action work together. So I hope that in bringing together, the odes, Martha Nussbaum, Iris Murdoch, I've been able to both shed some light on them and also on the Analects. And I want to end with the Analects 710, where the one right after the one that was organizing this talk, where the master says, have you mastered the odes from the south of Zhou and south of Shao? A person who has not done so is like someone standing with his face to the wall, is he not? And I think it's a great expression of the idea that without the odes, without literature, you literally cannot see. You're like someone with their face to a blank wall. So the odes for Confucius are not just window dressing. They're not just something to kind of dress up an argument. They're a technology that is crucial for teaching us how to see the world in the right way. Their technology for learning how to see. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
My share.
Thank you, Professor Slingerland. Thank you so much for the very interesting and inspiring lecture. And now we move on to our discussion part. And today we have two wonderful commentators. The first one is Professor Shirley Chen. Professor Chen joined the Macquarie University since 2002. And she is a member of the Macquarie University Research Center for Cultural Heritage and Environment. She has served as the president of the Chinese Studies Association of Australia and was an executive committee member of the Oriental Society of Australia for many years. Professor Chen published in both Chinese and English on Confucian philosophy, the ancient antiquity text, and other Chinese culture-related topics. Her recent publications include the Tao companion to the excavated body and bamboo manuscript, and reading through recovered ancient Chinese manuscript. Her current research is focusing on language and the philosophy of criticism in ancient China, so it's really interesting. And it is also worth mentioning that Professor Chen promotes the study of Chinese culture and humanity in general to the public communities, and has spoken on Confucian philosophy and Chinese culture in programs produced by the BBC, the ABC, and SBS. And I'd like to take it over to Professor Chen. So Professor, please feel free to start your comments or question. Thank you.
Thank you, first of all, to Paul for the kind invitation. I feel very humbled to be able to provide some comments to the lecture given by Professor Slingerland. And it was, of course, a great pleasure to see so many people here, including another commentator, Professor Stephen Engel. Yes, wow, what can I say? I mean, thank you, Professor Slingerland, for this very rich, substantial, and inspiring talk. Really, I don't have much to add other than just saying, you know, there's a lot to take away, and also still a lot for me to process and digest. Apparently, I haven't mastered the odes yet, but I think the first thing is to read more about your work, and which are really inspiring. Now, I think what is really fascinating is how you connect cognitive science and also, you know, the importance of moral perception, how it's related to literature. And of course, we know the Confucian tradition has a real emphasis on the study of the 6 arts, and also, you know, the 5 classics, and which all have very special values, cultural values, and also, you know, play a very important role in moral growth. And it's, of course, something that we are learning is all of this moral perception of growth is both a very active process as well, not just, you know, have all these different kinds of media or technology being fed into us, and the right environment and the right people, the right kind of literature, music, and examples that surround us is so important for moral growth. And of course, we know that not all kinds of literature or odes are appropriate for moral growth. And it is believed that Confucius himself has selected, 305 odes. And, the odes before his time, we probably were looking at thousands of odes. So, and the other thing I really appreciated was how you pointed out that moral cultivation or moral growth is not just about all this book learning process, but how we have this literature connect and provide a different world, or including the nature, and making the world very meaningful as well, and also to keep in touch with society. Right, the people around us, and the pointing out the special role of literature and art in general. So it's not just about some kind of a very rigid set of material that available, but how we can make this world meaningful and to be part of it. And as Confucius said, 仁者摇山, 智者摇水. So he's pointing out that our life is only meaningful if we are connected with the nature and with the world. And all of these literature are really playing a role here. And one of my favorite sayings in the Analects is probably 至于道据于德, 于人有于义. It's like a process of cultivation that at the end you're actually so free because you have mastered all these skills, namely literature, rituals, or music, and this, of course, the 6 arts, and don't forget about the 历史 as well, right? The book of documents and all that provides you all these different visions, political visions, poetic visions, and social visions, which really showing that moral cultivation is really a holistic, all-embracing sort of process. And so at the end, as Confucius said, you are able to to freely wandering in the world and enjoy it, and to have this achieve this state of joy, right? Look, and I think at the end you left us with a very challenging questions. What kind of literature and in general, what kind of education can we provide to our students as well? And you talk about, it's something about making the world meaningful, something appropriate, as Confucius would always say, emphasize the only look and hear and do what is appropriate and in accordance with Li, right? And I suppose art itself, it should be also a vehicle for the way, or 文以载道, or has this essence of 真善美, authenticity, the highest good, and the beauty or aesthetics significance as well. So really, I have nothing to add, but maybe some personal experience. It's also because nowadays we have AI, we have so many, we're exposed to a very complicated and world, through the internet, the social media and all that. And when I was, sometimes my daughters were watching, some kind of movies, and it's always, worries me, because sometimes, I saw the movies, people can speak some kind of language, and they can't speak without using some particular words, it's like something that you have to speak, and you have to use the words, otherwise you can't really express yourself, or you don't look cool or something, so I think this is the kind of challenges we have as well. And of course we hope our own nature can, or how to say, how can we play a more active role, and by providing some kind of the right teaching material, I suppose, even from the very early stage, right, of development for our children, for the new generation, I suppose. So yes, I think look, it's really fascinating, and I really enjoyed the talk. Thanks so much. I better leave the comments to Professor Engel. More comments. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you. So that was really helpful. Particularly, I think what you said about this is something I didn't talk about, was the flip side of so the art is shaping you, it's teaching you how to see, but it's also active from the student's perspective. And you see that a bit in that odes, the passage I quoted about what use of the odes are to you if you can't engage in repartee, if you can't use them flexibly. But you also see this in other passages where Confucius is talking about it's not just memorizing things. If you don't have a passion for it, if I can't give you one corner of the square and have you come back with the other three corners, then I'm not going to teach you. So there is, it's not a one-way kind of culture imposing these categories on you, these narratives on you. You have to, as a learner, be active in adopting them. And yes, there's a real issue with figuring out what the right narratives are. We're, as modern, living in modern liberal societies, we're very uncomfortable with the idea of censoring literature, let's say, with banning books or even telling people they shouldn't read these types of books. Confucius had no problem with that, right? He's happy to tell you what odes to read and what music to listen to. But it's trickier if in our modern world, and I don't know whether it's got to be the case that then individuals make these decisions. We definitely, when my daughter was younger, steered her toward certain types of art. And again, to focus on literature, we had some control over the books we bought for her, and so we had some influence on what she read. And you definitely saw. I remember thinking about how important literature was for moral development. When my daughter was little, she read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and was very much, impressed by the various other kids. So Charlie, of course, is Confucius. Charlie is the virtuous, benevolent one who we're supposed to model ourselves on. And the other kids all exemplify different vices, right? They all have different things wrong with them. And in particular, Veruca Salt, she's the very selfish one who just wants everything her way. And I had this experience once with my daughter being, I think she's out of earshot. She's old enough now, she doesn't care about this, but she was being very selfish and kind of self-centered and spoiled. And all I did was say to her, Veruca, and she just stopped. So, in just one word, I could call to mind this rich character that exemplified vices in a very dramatic way. And she was ashamed. She actually kind of blushed and she stopped doing what she was doing. So that's, we do this intuitively. We use literature with our children and with other people as ways to guide their behavior. But the issue of, which pieces of literature we should use is one that I don't think we have an easy answer for. And again, in a modern, cosmopolitan, multicultural society. So, and I don't know what I'm going to do about this in the book. Let's see. But thank you very much, Shirley.
Okay, thank you, Professor Slingerland, and thank you for Professor Shirley, and provide us very interesting discussion. And now let's welcome our another commentator, Professor Stephen Engel. Professor Engel is a director of the Ferry Center for Global Studies, Mansfield Freeman Professor of East Asia Studies, and Professor of Philosophy at Wesleyan University. He is a past president of the International Society for Comparative Study of Chinese and Western Philosophy. Professor Engel specialized in Confucianism and comparative philosophy, and his research focuses on philosophy's role in human rights, politics, and ethics, both in East Asia and globally. Professor Engel is the author of 5 books and co-editor of 2 others, including Growing Moral, A Confucian Guide to Life, and Virtue Ethics and Confucianism. Personally, I have learned a lot from this book, so thank you so much. And he is currently finishing a co-edited book called Progressive Confucianism and Its Critics, Dialogues from the Confucian Heartland. I believe that every scholar who studies Confucianism is looking forward to read this book as much as I am. Thank you. So let's welcome Professor Engel, and Professor, please feel free to give your question. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. That was lovely, and thank you, Ted, for a terrific talk. I am largely faced with the same challenge that Shirley just expressed, namely, I kind of agree, and so, but I can think of a few things to say, and one. I guess mainly I'm trying to be helpful about the question, the problem that you're grappling with at the end of the talk, and that you were just talking about in response to Shirley's comments. So about censorship, what is happening here? There we go. So, I mean, we do, even in a very liberal society in this respect, like the United States, there are things that we do. We have movie ratings, we don't let children of a certain age go to movies, and we, as a society, recommend that they don't go to others. And of course, there's a lot of research, somewhat mixed. You probably know more about it than I do, but about, say, violent video games and things of that nature, which I think that the ratings on things like that are just voluntary. But there is some stuff, anyways. And because I think it's an important issue, I feel like this is something to figure out what to say about. There's a way in which, when you say that for Kongzi or Aristotle or even Nussbaum or Murdoch, that they don't have this problem, I think I know what you mean, but would it be better to say that they didn't realize they had this problem? Because after all, I don't think we just give Aristotle a free pass for thinking that women are natural slaves. He did have a certain, unified common sense of his time view of what a phronimos was, but that there were a lot of people left out of that picture in a way that sure seems problematic when you perceive more broadly what was going on in his society. And I guess I'd want to say the same about the other folks. So you and I had a conversation a number of years ago about your experience in writing a trade book, which was, the conversation was not sufficiently discouraging to lead me to not do it. So Liu Menglu mentioned that I wrote this book called Growing Moral, which grapples with this question also, because I'm trying to think about what it is to live a contemporary Confucian life. And so one of the things that I do there that might be relevant in the chapter on music, which, right, my paradigm of a contemporary Confucian musician, there is Jimi Hendrix. And there's a lot, different things one could say about that. But part of how I get there is, right, one of the things music is supposed to do, a little bit different from literature, but this is another technology of the self for sure. It's supposed to create, it's supposed to unify us in a certain way. And you mentioned actually just a few minutes ago that narratives can create consensus. So Confucius wasn't much of a fan of new music. Mengzi was more open to it. And so there's an interesting distinction there, right? And then later Confucians have to deal with the fact that society's changed, musical technology has changed. They couldn't even recreate the music of the Zhou if they wanted to. And sometimes there were, sort of quixotic efforts to do so. But I think there is a recognition of different reasons why rituals, music, and so on and so forth should change. And I think that one can leverage that into, for music at least, something like the idea that the sort of musical forms of groups that have been historically excluded from mainstream ideas about unity, there's a good argument, that sort of a modern Confucian argument anyways, that we should include that kind of stuff. And so maybe you can think about literature, a multicultural canon or something like that, in something like the same way. Okay, one final comment, which is, this is just, I'm really not sure about this, but, as you know, you and others have, and you didn't really use the word connoisseur in your talk, but it's in the paper, and it's been around as a way of thinking about what the moral cultivation is. And certainly some of the stuff you were talking about in terms of expertise connects up with this also. And my question is really here is, it feels like moral perception and moral responsiveness is something that we all do all the time and mostly get right. I think, at least, so I'd posit that. And there are things we get wrong and things we miss and so on and so forth. But I guess I wonder how far and I don't really know how far you want to push the model of expertise. But is a like mediocre but semi-competent chess player sort of where the average person is with respect to kind of the game of life or something like that? And that maybe, I don't know what the experiments show, but maybe that person is pretty good at remembering where the pieces are, or maybe not. And if not, then I wonder how well that experiment is really tracking most of our moral life. Anyways, super great stuff, and look forward to your thoughts.
Great, thanks. That's all really helpful. Yeah, I think maybe I hadn't thought about that, and that's a really good point. Maybe the way to think about, and you're right. So in expert perception, I'm essentially talking about connoisseurship. Maybe the way to think about it is, expertise has been studied it's easiest to study in these completely artificial domains, right? No one's born knowing chess. It's a completely artificial practice that you can become an expert in. And that's the disanalogy with being a human, right? Humans just naturally have to learn how to be compassionate and how to be just and how to react with appropriate moral anger in certain situations. And so it's more like we all are chess players, and then there's kind of better and worse ones among us. So yeah, the expertise literature tends to focus on completely artificial domains that are culturally contingent and that aren't universal for humans. And that's what's different about morality. It's morality is something that, is, I think Mencius would say, we all have a taste for it. It's just people like Eric Hutton and, PJ relied on the connoisseur model. And I think that makes sense. The idea that morality is something we all have a taste for, just as being humans. But then the connoisseurs are those who kind of have refined it and maybe can help us see it better, help us see it more clearly, rather than it being a domain where until you're enculturated in it, you don't have any expertise at all or any ability at all. Yeah, it's interesting. I think that, so where the expertise connoisseurship thing does come in is I do think, unless you're Yan Hui, right, we all have work to do. So even though we all kind of have some level of expertise, we could be better. And I think that that's something Confucius believes, and I think it's just true of humans. We can all be constantly, for Murdoch, it's kind of paring away at selfishness. For her, seeing the world, what art is helping to do is de-shell us from selfishness and show us the world as it really is. So I think the expertise model and connoisseurship models are still important in terms of this idea of work has to happen, and refinement is always possible. We can always get better than we are. And we can rightly fault people for not trying to do so, for not trying to see the world in a more accurate way. I definitely have to check. When did Growing Moral come out? Is that recent?
A year plus ago. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll have to,
So, recently,
get it. So we'll talk more. I read it. It sounds really useful. I'm going to completely steal from you with attribution. I'm going to rephrase the way I talk about Aristotle and Confucius and the others. I think you're right that it's not that they didn't have this problem. I mean, what I meant by that was it didn't strike them as a problem, but you're right. It's just because they didn't realize it really was a problem for them. They were kind of inaccurately confident that they knew what the right literature is. And arguably Martha Nussbaum has misplaced confidence that she knows, and I'm not sure she would, if you questioned her, I think what she would say is, I know some works of great literature, and Henry James' Golden Bowl is one of them. I don't think she would then say this is the only canon that you can use. And I think that would be the anything like a right response is going to be something like that, where we can say, look, these are works of art that we all can recognize as art, as great art. And they can be very diverse, but there's going to be I think there should be some kind of idea that there's a pragmatic consensus that happens when people are being honest and they're informed. And sometimes it might take you some work to see it. So maybe someone who has no familiarity with Western music wouldn't understand Jimi Hendrix, what he's trying. So you have to show people what he's doing, right? But given that you could show them that, you'd expect then that they would respond and go, yeah, I can see why that's great. In the same way that this is where connoisseurship helps too, because I've always wanted to do this. I was about to do this study with a psychology colleague of mine on wine tasting. And then the expert who was advising us, who got us the wine, stole the wine, like disappeared and took all of our wine. And then we couldn't get human subject approval anyway, so we just gave up. But the idea behind it was going to be to try to demonstrate that. So what a wine connoisseur likes is different than what a novice likes. So people who don't drink much wine tend to like sweet wines or really alcoholic wines or wines with a lot of oak on them, kind of very powerful flavors, very powerful, but very one note type things. And as you gain perceptual experience with the domain, especially under the guidance of a teacher who can tell you, kind of like Mencius does with the in 1A7 with the king, where it's like, well, did it feel like this? How's that different from this other thing it could have felt? You know, when you're learning to taste wine, you do that too. It's like, this tastes like, can you taste the oak? It tastes like this. This tastes the tar. You develop an expertise that's grounded in sensory perceptions that can be brought out in anyone with sufficient experience. And so what we want to show is that if people do gravitate toward the better wines as defined by experts, and that process is accelerated with good coaching, as opposed to we're going to have an evil coaching condition where people were getting the exact opposite advice about what was a good wine, and see if that actually pushed people. But yeah, I think one way to solve this problem is a pragmatic one of just, look, we've got works of art that when people are sufficiently given the background they need, they will go, yeah, that's good art. And maybe we can't even define formally what the features of that type of art is, and we just have to rely on consensus, community consensus. But thanks, these were very great comments and very helpful.
Well, thank you. I really want to say thank you to our two scholars, and I learned a lot from your discussion. And maybe we have some time for some questions, some short questions from our audience. So is there any question or our audience, if you have any question, please, you can just type the question on the chat box, or you can just open your microphone or video. Is there any question? And the shorter one will be welcomed. Okay. Is there any question? Okay. Maybe may I take the advantage of my chair position to raise my question? Actually, my question is similar to our professors mentioned before. Is does everyone have the moral perception? I mean, when she reading literature or some poem, or just I just wondering, maybe the person who can cultivate her moral perception through reading literature is the person, maybe in a certain way, she's already a virtuous person. So she has the ability, has the perceptual ability to say something meaningful, to say something moral in the literature, or not just the materials about some words, just like this. So maybe the self-cultivation by reading literature or by learning how to say from literature is just a thing for a virtuous person, but not for everyone. I don't know if it's right or wrong, or there's something else. Thank you.
Yeah, it relates to this question of like Steve's point about chess versus morality. So I think that, I guess I'm fundamentally a mention in this regard. And I also think that there's very good empirical support for something like a naturalized version of the mention position, which is that we all have the sprouts of virtue. We all kind of have inborn moral reactions that are domain specific. They're modular in the modern cognitive scientific jargon. So they, in the same way, there's the four hearts for Mencius. We have different moral emotions that have different feelings. They have different behavioral patterns they set in motion. They have different facial expressions that go with them, and they're triggered by different categories of things in the world. So suffering, the sight of suffering, triggers the compassion reaction. The sight of injustice triggers a different kind of reaction, kind of angry wanting to punish people for injustice. I think that there's no one who doesn't have, well, so I think with Mencius that any healthy human being has this. It's possible that if you had a really abusive, terrible childhood, maybe the sprouts would have been stamped out or destroyed. It's also, I think, the case that certain people, like psychopaths, are born without one of the sprouts. So psychopaths seem to just completely lack the sprout of empathy. And so, but I think, so in that case, I think anyone can have a moral reaction to literature because everyone has the sprouts, everyone has the kind of basic architecture. But as with, Mencius's agriculture metaphor, these need to be cultivated and trained and shaped in various ways. And that's where I think, good versus bad literature could have different effects on you. Good literature would help shape you in the right direction. Bad literature would be like a tomato trellis that's crooked and it's making your sprouts grow the wrong way. So yeah, I think that this is the disanalogy with something like chess, where it's completely arbitrary cultural practice. No one has natural expertise in chess. I think everyone has natural expertise in morality, and art is tapping into those basic sprouts, to use mentioned language.
Yeah, I totally understand and agree with you. And maybe time is up. I believe that everyone will very enjoy our lecture and our discussion part today. And I really want to say thank you again for our lecturer, our commentator, and our listeners. So thank you and have a nice day.
Yeah, thank you all. Thanks, Shirley and Steve. Great. Steve, I'll see you next week.
Sounds good.
Bye. Bye.